Part 1. The Shadow in the Jungle. In the year 1839, two men named John Lloyd Stevens and Frederick Catherwood hacked through the suffocating humidity of the Honduran jungle. They were not looking for gold. They were looking for a ghost. What they found would change human history forever. Rising out of the tangled vines and mahogany trees were massive, jagged silhouettes of stone. As they cleared the moss, they revealed intricate carvings of faces, serpents, and a strange, alien script. These were not the works of a primitive people. These were the skeletal remains of a high civilization with meticulously planned cities, soaring pyramids, and plazas that once echoed with the footsteps of thousands. Stevens wrote in his journal that all was mystery, a dark and impenetrable mystery. For over a century, that mystery remained. How did a civilization that never used the wheel, never used beasts of burden, and never smelted iron, manage to build a sprawling empire in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth? And more importantly, why, at the height of its glory, did it all simply stop? To understand the collapse, we must first understand the height. At its peak, the Maya civilization was not a single empire like Rome. It was a fractured landscape of competing city-states, much like ancient Greece. From the highlands of Guatemala to the limestone plains of the Yucatan, the Maya transformed the landscape. They did not just live in the jungle. They re-engineered it. They built massive seasonal wetlands into sophisticated irrigation systems. They constructed white stone highways called cbeebies that cut through the green canopy for hundreds of miles. But the most striking feature of Maya life was the Holy Lord, known as the Cayuhul-Ajo. To the Maya, the king was not just a political leader. He was the bridge between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. The king's blood was the fuel of the universe. Through ritual bloodletting, the king ensured that the sun would rise and the rains would fall. This created a dangerous social contract. In the Maya world, prosperity was proof of the king's divinity. But if the rains failed, it was not just a natural disaster. It was a theological crisis. It meant the king had lost his connection to the gods. Long before the classic collapse of 900 AD, there was an earlier rise and fall. We often think of the Maya as starting small, but recent laser technology has revealed a staggering truth. In the Mirador Basin, as early as 300 BC, the Maya were already building super cities. These were larger than almost anything built during the later classic period. The Danta Pyramid is one of the largest structures in the ancient world by volume. And yet by 150 AD, these cities were abandoned. This first collapse was a warning. It showed that the Maya environment was fragile. The soil was thin. The water was scarce. But the Maya did not learn. They moved into the lowlands, and for 600 years, they built the most sophisticated society the Americas had ever seen. Part 2. The Divine Kings and the Blood Debt. To understand why the Maya cities were eventually abandoned, we have to look deeper into their daily reality. Their world was not divided into the natural and the supernatural. Everything was alive. The mountains were gods, the caves were portals to the underworld, and the king was the axis upon which the entire universe turned. In the great plazas of Tikal and Palenque, the king would appear before thousands of his subjects. He would be dressed in the iridescent green feathers of the quetzal bird, draped in heavy jade jewelry and wearing a towering headdress. But being a king was a burden of blood. The Maya believed that the gods had sacrificed their own blood to create humanity. Therefore, humanity owed a blood debt to the gods to keep the world in motion. If the debt was not paid, the sun would stop, and the universe would dissolve into chaos. This meant the king's primary job was ritual bloodletting. Using obsidian blades or stingray spines, the king and queen would pierce their own flesh to offer their life force to the earth. To the modern ear, this sounds gruesome. But to a Maya farmer, this was a moment of profound hope. They believed that as long as the king bled, the rains would come. But this system had a fatal flaw. It linked the climate directly to the king's political legitimacy. As long as the weather was good and the harvests were plentiful, the king was a god. But if a drought lasted too long, it meant the king's blood was no longer powerful. It meant the gods had rejected him. By the middle of the 8th century, this social contract began to shred. The population of the Maya lowlands had reached its absolute limit. Estimates suggest there were between 10 and 15 million people living in a region that today supports only a fraction of that number. Every hillside was terraced. Every swamp was drained. The Maya were living on the edge of an environmental precipice. Then, the climate shifted. Part 3. The Scars of the Earth and the Great Drought. Modern technology has allowed us to look at the Maya collapse with new eyes. We no longer have to guess about the weather 1,000 years ago. By studying the chemistry of stalagmites in caves, scientists have reconstructed a year-by-year record of the Maya climate. What they found was a catastrophe. Beginning around the year 760, the Maya heartland was hit by a series of severe, multi-year droughts. This was not just a few dry summers. These were decades-long periods where the seasonal rain simply vanished. For a civilization in the middle of a tropical forest, you might think water was everywhere. But the southern Maya lowlands are a seasonal desert. There are no major rivers like the Nile or the Amazon. The Maya survived by building massive, sophisticated reservoirs lined with plaster to catch the summer rains. They were entirely dependent on the sky. As the droughts deepened, the reservoirs turned to cracked mud. The corn, which provided 80% of the Maya diet, shriveled in the fields. And here is where the king's burden became his downfall. As the people starved, they looked to their holy lords to make it right. They expected the rituals to bring the storm clouds, but the skies stayed blue. Instead of working together to solve the crisis, the kings did what desperate leaders have done throughout history. They went to war. They blamed their neighbors. They fought over the few remaining water sources. The archaeological record shows a chilling change during this time. The carvings on the stone monuments stop being about the stars. They become obsessed with captives, torture, and the glorification of war. The great cities began to build defensive walls made of stone stripped from their own temples. This was the beginning of the end. Part 4. The War of the Snakes. To understand the violence of the collapse, we have to look at the superpower rivalry that defined the era. For centuries, the Maya world was dominated by two great capital cities. In the south was Tikal, a city of ancient lineage and towering pyramids. In the north was Calakmul, the kingdom of the snake. These two cities were locked in a struggle that lasted for generations. They did not usually fight each other directly. Instead, they used smaller cities as pawns. They traded marriage alliances, backed coups in rival territories, and staged raids to capture enemy nobles for sacrifice. This system of balanced power kept the Maya world stable for a long time. But as the environmental pressure mounted, the balance broke. The snake kings of Calakmul began to tighten their grip on the trade routes. They surrounded Tikal with a ring of allied cities, effectively strangling the great metropolis. In the year 695, Tikal struck back in a massive battle that broke the power of the Snake Kingdom. But the victory was hollow. The warfare had become endemic. It had moved from the ritualized capture of nobles to total war. Farmers were no longer safe in their fields. The terraces that had fed millions were abandoned because they were too far from the safety of the city walls. In the Pedixbatan region, archaeologists have found evidence of cities that were literally torn apart to build fortifications. Beautiful palaces were stripped of their stones to build walls that ran through the middle of plazas. The people were no longer building for eternity. They were building for the next week. Part 5. The Stucco Tax and Environmental Suicide. While the droughts were a natural disaster, the Maya unknowingly made them much worse. We often think of ancient people as living in perfect harmony with nature, but the Maya were a massive industrial society. Their greatest achievement was also their greatest mistake, the lime plaster or stucco that covered every building. To the Maya, a city was not just stone. It was a shimmering, painted jewel. Every pyramid, every plaza, and every home of the elite was coated in thick, white lime plaster, and painted in vibrant reds and yellows. To create this lime, they had to harvest limestone and bake it in massive kilns at incredibly high temperatures. This required an astronomical amount of wood. Scientists estimate that to coat just one large building in a city like Tikal, the Maya had to clear-cut and burn hundreds of acres of virgin rainforest. As the cities grew larger and the kings grew more ambitious, the demand for wood became a hunger that could not be satisfied. By the 8th century, the forests surrounding the great cities were gone. The loss of the trees triggered a chain reaction. Without the canopy to shade the ground, the soil temperature rose. Without the roots to hold the earth, the tropical rains washed the fertile topsoil into the lakes and reservoirs, turning them into silty marshes. This is what ecologists call a positive feedback loop, but there was nothing positive about it. The less forest there was, the less moisture was released into the atmosphere, which in turn reduced the rainfall even further. The Maya had literally burned their future to make their monuments look beautiful. Part 6. The Falling Dominoes. The collapse did not happen all at once. It was a wave of failure that moved across the landscape. It began in the southwest, in the lush river valleys where the warfare was most intense. One of the most tragic stories is that of the city of Dos Pilas. Originally founded as an outpost of Tikal, it became a center of a breakaway kingdom. For a few decades, it flourished. But by 760 AD, the city was under siege. The citizens were so desperate that they tore down the outer facades of their most beautiful temples to build two concentric defensive walls. They even built these walls across the royal palace and the ceremonial plazas. It didn't work. Archaeologists found the remains of Dos Pilas scattered and broken. The people fled, and the city was never inhabited again. From Dos Pilas, the collapse spread like a virus. In city after city, the story was the same. The last dated monument, or stela, gives us a timestamp for when the lights went out. At Palenque, the last date recorded is 799 AD. At Kapan, it is 822. At the once mighty Tikal, the last monument was carved in 879 AD. When the scribes stopped carving dates, it meant the political structure had died. The king was gone. The priests were gone. The artisans who knew the complex script were gone. The cities became shells. Small groups of squatters lived in the ruins of the palaces for a few years, cooking their meals on the floors of royal bedchambers, but eventually even they gave up. The jungle began its long, slow march back over the stones. Part 7. The Great Migration and the Northern Shift. So where did millions of people go? They did not all die of thirst or war. The Maya were survivors. As the southern cities failed, a massive migration began. This was one of the largest movements of people in human history. The survivors moved toward the coast and toward the north, into the Yucatan Peninsula. Here, the environment was different. There were no mountains and fewer rivers, but there were cenotes, natural limestone sinkholes that provided access to the underground water table. This led to the rise of the new empire, or the post-classic period. While Tikal was being swallowed by the jungle, cities like Uxmal and Chichen Itza were just beginning their golden age. But the culture had changed. The Maya had learned a bitter lesson about the divine kings. In these northern cities, we see a shift away from the worship of a single, god-like individual. Instead, they moved toward a more multiple, or joint rule system. The art became less about the biography of a king and more about the gods and the community. They became a more mercantile, seafaring society, trading obsidian and salt along the coasts. But even these northern cities would eventually face their own struggles. The social fabric of the Maya had been permanently altered. The era of the mountain-sized pyramids was over. Part 8. The Architects of Time. To understand the Maya collapse, one must understand how they viewed time itself. For the Maya, time was not a straight line moving from the past into the future. It was a series of overlapping cycles, like the gears of a great cosmic clock. They believed that history repeated itself. If a disaster happened in one cycle, it was destined to happen again when that cycle returned. The Maya developed three separate calendars. The first was the Tzolk'in, a 260-day spiritual calendar. The second was the Hab, a 365-day solar calendar. When these two wheels turned together, they created the calendar round, a 52-year cycle. But their greatest achievement was the long count. This was a linear count of days starting from a mythical creation date in the year 3114 BC. Because they could track time over thousands of years, they became the greatest astronomers of the ancient world. Without telescopes, they calculated the lunar month with a precision that differs from modern satellite measurements by only 34 seconds. They tracked the synodic period of Venus, the movement of Mars, and predicted solar eclipses with terrifying accuracy. But this scientific brilliance was tied to a dark purpose. The Maya did not study the stars for the sake of curiosity. They studied them for survival. They believed the movements of the planets were the movements of the gods. If the astronomers miscalculated, the king might perform a ritual on the wrong day, and the sun might not return. This put immense pressure on the elite class. When the collapse began, and the astronomical predictions no longer seemed to guarantee prosperity, the entire intellectual foundation of their society began to rot. Part 9. The Written Word in the Lost Libraries. The Maya were the only civilization in the Americas to develop a fully functional, phonetic writing system. They could write anything they could say. Their glyphs were a beautiful, complex mix of pictures and sounds. They wrote on stone stelae, on pottery, and in books made of bark paper called codices. During the height of the classic period, every city had massive libraries containing thousands of years of history, genealogy, and scientific data. One of the greatest tragedies of the collapse is that, as the cities were abandoned, these libraries were left to the humidity and the insects of the jungle. Bark paper does not survive long in a rainforest. By the time the Spanish arrived centuries later, only a handful of these books remained. And in a moment of cultural genocide, Bishop Diego de Landa ordered the remaining Maya books to be burned, claiming they were the work of the devil. Only 4 codices survived. This loss of information is why the collapse remained a mystery for so long. We lost the Maya's own account of their end. We have to piece the story together from the silent evidence, the bones, the seeds, and the stones. Part 10. The Post-Classic Revival. As we discussed, the collapse of the southern cities like Tikal did not mean the end of the Maya. It meant a migration. The focus shifted to the northern Yucatan and the highlands. This era, known as the Post-Classic, was defined by cities like Chichén Itzá and later Mayapan. If you visit Chichén Itzá today, you see a different kind of architecture. It is more militaristic, more open, and influenced by the Toltecs from central Mexico. The Maya had become a more globalized people. They were no longer isolated in the deep jungle. They were masters of the sea. They developed a massive coastal trade network using giant cedar canoes that could carry up to 50 people and tons of cargo. They traded honey, salt, and slaves for turquoise from the American Southwest and gold from Costa Rica. For a few hundred years, it looked like the Maya had found a new way to live, a way that didn't rely on the absolute power of a divine king. But the scars of the old collapse were still there. The population never reached its previous heights. The art was never as refined. The writing system began to simplify. The Maya were a civilization in a long, slow twilight. Part 11. The Arrival of the Bearded Men. In the early 16th century, the Maya world faced a threat that no cycle of time could have predicted. The Spanish arrived. Unlike the Aztec or Inca empires, which fell relatively quickly because they had a centralized government, the Maya were decentralized. When the Spanish killed a Maya leader, there were dozens of other independent city-states ready to fight. Because of this, the conquest of the Maya took over 170 years. The Maya fought a guerrilla war from the deep jungles. They used the same terrain that had once supported their great cities to hide from the Spanish cavalry. But the Spanish brought a weapon more deadly than the sword: smallpox. Diseases for which the Maya had no immunity swept through the villages, killing up to 90% of the population in some areas. Even so, the last independent Maya kingdom, the island city of Najbatane, did not fall until 1697. That is more than a century and a half after the fall of the Aztecs. Part 12. The Modern Discovery in l'Idar. For centuries, the great cities of the South remained hidden. The world forgot they existed. Then, in the 19th and 20th centuries, explorers and archaeologists began the slow process of reclaiming them from the forest. But the biggest breakthrough came only a few years ago. A technology called l'Idar, which stands for light detection and ranging, allowed scientists to drain the jungle away using lasers from an airplane. What they found was shocking. The Maya civilization was much larger than we ever imagined. Under the trees, there are tens of thousands of previously unknown structures. There are highways, fortresses, and massive agricultural terraces. It turns out the Maya had transformed nearly every square inch of their environment. This discovery changed the collapse narrative once again. It showed us that the Maya didn't just fail because they were primitive. They failed because they were too advanced for their own good. They had built a system so complex and so demanding that it had no margin for error. When the climate changed, the system couldn't bend, so it snapped. For a commoner living in the outskirts of Tikal or Kapen, life was defined by the rhythm of the soil. Their homes were not made of stone, but of perishable wood, mud, and thatch. Because these houses decayed centuries ago, they were invisible to early archaeologists. But modern excavations have found the hidden foundations of millions of these humble dwellings. The average Maya family lived in a small compound with several houses facing a central courtyard. They were master gardeners. While the kings were focused on war, the commoners were focused on biodiversity. They practiced a system called the milpa. They didn't just plant corn, they planted beans and squash in the same holes. The beans provided nitrogen for the soil, and the squash leaves provided shade to keep the moisture in the earth. But as the population grew, the pressure on these farmers became unbearable. In the early days, a farmer could leave a field fallow for 10 years to let the nutrients return. By the year 800, they were lucky if they could leave it for 2. The soil was being pushed to its breaking point. Imagine being a farmer during the great droughts. You have paid your taxes to the king in the form of labor and food. You have watched the forests disappear to provide lime for the temples. Now the rains have stopped. You look up at the great stone city on the hill where the king is performing his rituals. You see the smoke from the sacrifices, but the clouds never come. This was the moment the social fabric began to tear. The commoners didn't just die, they walked away. They realized that the cities, for all their beauty, had become death traps. Part 14. Tikal, the Fallen Giant. Let us look at the specific end of the greatest city of them all, Tikal. At its height, Tikal was the New York City of the Maya world. It had skyscrapers made of limestone that rose over 200 feet into the air. It was a center of trade, art, and power. The end of Tikal was not a violent explosion. It was a long, agonizing decay. By the year 850, the city was in deep trouble. The great reservoirs, which were the lifeblood of the city, were becoming contaminated. Recent studies of the sediment at the bottom of Tikal's reservoirs have found high levels of mercury and toxic algae. The mercury came from the cinnabar paint the Maya used to decorate their buildings and their dead. When the rains did fall, they washed this toxic dust into the drinking water. The very beauty of the city was poisoning the people. As the elite fled, the city's maintenance stopped. The plaster on the reservoirs cracked and the water leaked out. The last date ever carved at Tikal was in the year 879 AD. After that, the scribes went silent. But we know people stayed for a little longer. Archaeologists found evidence of small fires built in the middle of the great palaces. These were not the controlled fires of a royal court. They were the campfires of desperate people scavenging for a place to sleep in a dying city. They left their trash in the corners of the throne rooms. They used the royal tombs as shelters. Eventually, even they realized that without a functioning water system, Tikal was a graveyard. They left, and the forest began its thousand-year work of burying the city. Part 15. Palenque and the Western Collapse. While Tikal was a city of giants, Palenque was a city of artists. Located in the foothills of the Chiapas Mountains, Palenque is famous for its delicate architecture and its deep obsession with history. This was the city of Pakal the Great, the king who was buried in a massive stone sarcophagus that some people, incorrectly, believe looks like a rocket ship. Palenque's collapse was different from Tikal's. It was one of the first major cities to fall, and its end was likely driven by a combination of internal revolt and external pressure from the Tabasco Plains. As the drought hit, the agricultural terraces of Palenque could no longer support the elite. In the art of Palenque's final years, we see a strange shift. The kings are no longer depicted as all-powerful. They look smaller, more human, and sometimes even humiliated. There is evidence that the common people eventually rose up against the ruling family. In several palaces, the stone thrones were deliberately smashed, and the faces of the kings on the wall carvings were scratched out. This wasn't the work of an invading army. This was the work of a local population that was angry, hungry, and finished with the lies of the divine kings. By the year 800, Palenque was a ghost town. Part 16. Copan and the Death of the Trees. In the southeast, the city of Copan provides the clearest evidence of environmental suicide. Copan was located in a beautiful, fertile river valley. For centuries, it was a paradise, but the hillsides surrounding the valley were steep. To feed the growing population, the people of Copan began to farm the hillsides. They cut down the trees to plant corn. Without the tree roots to hold the soil, the first heavy rains caused massive landslides. The fertile soil from the hills washed down and buried the good farmland in the valley under layers of useless clay. Skeletal remains from Copan during this period show a horrifying reality. The bones of children are riddled with signs of malnutrition and anemia. Even the skeletons of the royal family show that they were starving. When the king of Copan died, no one replaced him. The royal palace was burned, not by an enemy, but by people who were looking for the last bits of value inside. By the time the city was completely abandoned, the valley was a wasteland. It took centuries for the forest to recover and for the soil to become fertile again. Copan is a warning to every civilization that believes it can outsmart the laws of biology. Part 17. Xibalba and the Terror of the Underworld. To understand why the Maya stayed in their cities as long as they did, even as the walls crumbled, you have to understand their fear of the dark. To the Maya, the underworld was a real, physical place called Xibalba, which translates to the place of fear. It was not a place for the dead to rest. It was a place of trial and torture. They believed that every night the sun died and had to fight its way through the lords of Xibalba to rise again the next morning. The kings were the ones who assisted in this cosmic battle. When the cities began to fail, the Maya did not just see a lack of food or water. They saw the literal triumph of the lords of death over the world of the living. The Maya believed that caves were the physical entrances to Xibalba. In the final years of the collapse, we see a frantic increase in cave rituals. Archaeologists have found thousands of pottery shards, bloodletting tools, and even human sacrifices deep inside caves like Najtunish. These were the last, desperate prayers of a dying society. They were going to the very gates of the underworld to beg the gods for mercy. The gods of Xibalba were masters of trickery and disease. There was the Lord of Pus, the Lord of Jaundice, and the Lord of Filth. As the droughts brought disease and the stagnant reservoirs brought infection, The Maya saw the physical manifestation of these demons in their daily lives. The psychological toll must have been staggering. Imagine living in a world where you believe the very ground beneath your feet is hungry for your soul, and your only protectors, the kings, have failed. Part 18. The Queens of the Maya. For a long time, history books only talked about the Maya kings. But as we have deciphered more of the glyphs, a new story has emerged. The story of the powerful women who often held the civilization together during its most turbulent times. In the Maya world, marriage was the ultimate diplomatic tool. Powerful cities like Tikal or Calakmul would send their princesses to smaller cities to marry the local lords. These women were not just ornaments. They were ambassadors, spies, and often the true power behind the throne. One of the most famous was Lady Six Sky of Duz Pilas. She arrived at the city of Naranjo to restart a failed dynasty. She didn't just rule as a queen mother. She acted as a military commander. Carvings show her standing over captives, a position usually reserved for the most warlike kings. Then there was Lady Kayable of the Snake Kingdom, who was known as the Supreme Warrior. She ruled for decades and was considered more powerful than her own husband. These women were the glue that held the fractured Maya map together. During the collapse, as the men were killed in battle, it was often the queens who kept the cities functioning for a few extra years. But eventually, even the great dynasties of the queens could not overcome the drying of the wells and the anger of the starving masses. Part 19. The Mystery of the Abandoned Tools. One of the most haunting details of the Maya collapse is what the people left behind. In many houses and workshops, archaeologists find tools, half-finished pottery, and jade jewelry sitting exactly where they were 1,000 years ago. This tells us that in some places the abandonment was sudden. It wasn't a planned migration. It was a flight of terror. Perhaps a neighboring city attacked, or perhaps the final reservoir dried up, and the people realized they had to leave that very day or they would die of thirst. In the city of Aguatka, the evidence is chilling. The city was built on a high limestone bluff, a natural fortress. But the enemy found a way in. The people fled so quickly that they left their most valuable possessions, their grinding stones, their spinning whorls, and their ceremonial masks. They ran into the jungle with nothing but the clothes on their backs. This is the true face of the collapse. It wasn't a grand historical event to the people living through it. It was the loss of their homes, their history, and their safety. The jungle moved in so quickly that within 2 generations, the children of those who fled wouldn't even know where their grandparents' houses had been. Part 20. The Maya Today and the Lesson of Resilience. As we reach the conclusion of this 10,000-word journey, we must address the most important fact of all. The Maya are not gone. Too many documentaries end with the image of a ruined pyramid swallowed by trees, implying that the people disappeared. But today, there are over 6 million Maya people living in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. They speak over 30 different Maya languages, from Quechua to Yucatec. They survived the collapse of the classic cities. They survived the Spanish conquest. They survived the rubber and coffee booms of the 19th century and the civil wars of the 20th century. Their resilience is perhaps the most impressive thing about them. The Great Collapse of 900 AD was not the end of a people. It was the end of an idea. It was the end of the idea that humans could infinitely exploit their environment without consequence. It was the end of the idea that a single ruler could bridge the gap between heaven and earth. The Maya who walked away from Tikal and Kapen chose life over the city. They chose the small village over the massive monument. They returned to a way of living that was smaller, more sustainable, and more connected to the rhythms of the earth. Pause. As we look at the ruins of Tikal today, we shouldn't just see a graveyard. We should see a warning. The Maya collapse reminds us that no matter how advanced our technology, no matter how great our monuments, we are all ultimately dependent on the health of our soil, the purity of our water, and the stability of our climate. The stones of the Maya are silent, but if you listen closely, they have a lot to tell us about our own future.